Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Nice to have you all with us. Welcome. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome back to our outstanding guest tonight, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, a hero to many of us, courageous former congressman, and to our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle. Next week, as all weeks in the coming months, we will again be hosting 2 programs per week. On Monday, we have our 17th Israel and Crisis program featuring Ambassador Dennis Ross, who will update us on the very tense situation in the Middle East. Our moderator for that program will be Pat Morrison. Then on Wednesday of next week, we will hear from former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, on the topic, "A World at War, Is There Any Chance for Peace?" And our moderator for that program will be Warren Olney. We hope you'll join us for both programs. You can sign up in the email you get right after tonight's program. And be sure to send these emails to your friends. Many of them may not be on our list, and we'd love for them to join us. So just tell them not to unsubscribe when they get your email, because then you won't get any emails and they won't as well. Reminder, all 225 of our programs to date are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel and our website. And links to our past programs are in every email we send. So if you go to any email at all from me or from Judge, you'll find links, or you can go to our website, www.jewsunitedfordemocracy.org, and you can find all of that information. You can always send me an email if you can't find anything, and I do respond to every email. We encourage you to send our links, as I said, to your friends, and especially as the November election nears. We've got some incredible programs coming up. Now to introduce tonight's guest and to embark on what promises to be a great discussion, please welcome my colleague and partner in this America at a Crossroads series, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel served as a most popular congressman from the west side of Los Angeles from 1983 to 1993. Before that, I have to say, just facts that you should know, Mel was student body president and valedictorian at his beloved Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, after which he attended Princeton for graduate school and Harvard Law School. And we're very proud to have him as our partner in this program. And now I hand the program over to Mel to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. That's a lot of ancient history. I very much appreciate your warmth and thoughtfulness, and you are a wonderful partner. I'm delighted to be able to introduce former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. I think, summarize my introduction in one sentence, which is, in my view, all Americans owe Adam Kinzinger a debt of thanks for his plain-spoken courage and being one of only a very small handful of Republican members of the House to directly stand up to a deranged bully. I had not met Adam until 10 minutes ago by Zoom, and I didn't have the privilege of serving with him, but I have greatly admired his straightforward willingness to defend our Constitution and our democracy when tragically, almost his entire caucus, for a variety of reasons, largely out of fear, first I think of losing their seat, and subsequently fear for their own safety and that of their family, Adam stood up, and along with Liz Cheney, were one of 2 people who had the courage and the decency basically to tell the truth. In addition to serving in Congress for 12 years, Adam is a lieutenant colonel in the Air National Guard and is a senior political commentator for CNN, and we're delighted to have Adam here with us this evening. We are very fortunate again to have Larry Mantle, our superstar interviewer. He will be interviewing Congressman Kinzinger. Our audience knows Larry well. He's been the host of Air Talk on NPR station KPCC since April 1st, 1985. About 40 years, which is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California. Larry is a recipient of numerous awards for his superb journalism, and we're really fortunate to have Larry regularly as one of our interviewers. And I turn the floor over to Larry.
Mel, thank you so much. It's always an honor to be here for America to Crossroads. Janice, thank you very much. And Zev in absentia. It's a pleasure to get to talk about some of the most challenging issues that we face in our society and, of course, politically in this country as well. And tonight I'm looking forward to hearing what the former congressman has to say. I do want to invite you, as we always do, to ask your questions in the Q&A that we've got at the bottom of your screen. And I'd ask you to please include your location with your first name, if you wouldn't mind. It's just nice to get a sense of what part of the country or what part of the world that you're viewing this on, as we know we have so many people across the United States and internationally who enjoy America at a crossroads. Congressman, thank you so much. Good to have you with us this evening.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thanks. Good to, even though I don't get to see everybody, good to sort of see everybody.
We have several thousand people who are viewing the program. First of all, I want to ask you about your evolution in your perception of former President Trump. I'm so curious. When he began his candidacy 8 years ago, more than 8 years ago, and when you were getting a sense of him, what were your thoughts then? We know what they are now, but what were they like in the initial months and years?
Yeah, so I kind of did a little journey of like hating Trump, trying to tolerate Trump, back to hating Trump, to be honest. So when he started running, I mean, I, like everybody else, thought he was a joke, right? Like there's no way. I mean, I was a Jeb Bush guy. If we could just have those days back, it would be magic. But and nobody took Trump seriously. In hindsight, by the way, and maybe we could talk about this more, but in hindsight, we should have seen this coming. And I also think there's something good coming that we're kind of sensing now, similar to what was bad coming in 2015. But I actually did not endorse Trump and did not vote for him in 2016. And particularly the thing that got me, yes, the Access Hollywood tape and all that, but even before that was when he went after both John McCain, of course, which to me is unthinkable, a friend of mine, and then the Gold Star family at the convention. The Cons, I think, or whatever, I forget their names, but and that to me was just it was incredible. And plus, not to mention that in the 2016 platform, it was Paul Manafort that pulled out the pro-Ukraine language. So I started to get this sense something was weird. So I didn't vote for him in 16, but he gets elected, and I'm making the decision, and I guess I was hopeful that everybody was, that he would grow into the job. It's one thing to run, it's another thing to be president. So I tried to work with him on a number of areas. I'd call him out when it was necessary, but really the big break came. And so I'm like the only guy in America that actually ended up then voting for him in 2020. And that was actually a weak thing I did. I did it because of all the crap I had to do from 2016 for not voting for him. And I'm like, I live in Illinois, he's going to lose, I'll just vote for him and never have to answer that question again. But that night, the night of the election, when he said, stop the count, or he came out and gave that press conference and said they're stealing the vote, that was my hard break. And I'll just quickly say why, because, we look at that and we're like, oh, it's Donald Trump being Donald Trump. But no, for democracy to survive, the only thing you have to have, we don't have to agree on a single thing. No, I mean, that's like democracy's built because we disagree. But we have to agree that our voting system will count the votes of those who can legally vote and that the winner wins. That's it. That's the only compact we need to self-govern. And when he comes out and starts convincing a significant amount of the country that an election was stolen or that our election system doesn't work, Larry, it was just, I knew that the next step is civil war. We were a country founded on the idea of taxation with representation. And that is damaging to democracy permanently. So that's when that started. And of course, we can get more into the evolution, but January 6th was the big one.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. I just a quick aside here. So in 2016, you voted for Hillary Clinton, or you abstained from the presidential vote?
I wrote in Evan McMullin, who was running as an independent.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about your endorsement of Vice President Harris, because as someone, you're a conservative. This isn't a case where, as I understand it, you've had a political evolution away from Republican conservatism. That's still, it sounds like, your ideological core. So how do you make peace with supporting a vice presidential candidate who is, I guess you would say, either center left, or as many Republicans would say, a true progressive. How do you abide that?
Yeah, it's very easy. So you did say Republican conservatism, and the only issue I take with that is I don't think that exists anymore. There's conservatism, and I would consider myself center right, moderate on some things, more conservative on others. But Republicanism is not conservative anymore. I mean, it really isn't. There is, you could go down the line and say, is this a party that believes in smaller government to help the little man? No, it's a party that believes in dividing, in stomping down. The head of the Republican Party is more interested in punching down to the little guy than punching across at somebody like Vladimir Putin, for instance. And so I think the Republican Party is totally divorced from conservatism now. So you take that and you go, okay, I could either vote for a fascist party, basically, or I could vote for somebody I disagree with on policy. But here's the thing. So I'll use a military analogy quick, because that's how I think. If I'm in a trench, okay, fighting a war, and there's an enemy 30 meters off, and there's an enemy 5 meters off, all of my attention, me and the guys, have to be at that 5-meter enemy, because it doesn't matter who's out there 30 meters away if we can't take care of the 5-meter enemy. The 30-meter enemy, in my mind, is just political differences, right? It's a disagreement on taxation or whatever. That's that. The 5-meter is the threat to democracy. And I have go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, so I have a 2.5-year-old kid, and in my mind, we're not on a track to leave him the kind of democracy I got to grow up with. And that to me is the most important thing, because we'll disagree on issues and we'll have the same arguments for another 100 years. This is the real threat.
I think for many Americans, there's a lack of understanding how you take many people who were Republicans 10 years ago and would have said they subscribed to smaller government, free trade, pushing back against totalitarian regimes, all these things that we thought of at that time as Republican, and that now have adopted a populist mindset. So my question is, did the world change for those folks that they felt like, well, that was fine for them, but we live in such a different world now. Now we need these populist approaches. Or did something else happen that caused those people who were there then and are still in the party now to make this shift?
Yeah, I think if you look back at like Nazi Germany and you say, how in the world could people who worked in a factory or, served in the army, the regular German army, how could they end up manning concentration camps? And how could they end up, just killing innocent people? And it's like, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. If you begin to make little compromises, okay, well, I'll just be quiet while Donald Trump says this because I don't want to get on his radar. Yeah, I guess, I can adopt isolationist policies because, again, if I don't get reelected, somebody worse is going to come along. And eventually you make so many compromises that A, you forget who you are and you forget what you were actually tethered to. And I think B, it's the sunken cost fallacy. Why is it that we didn't leave Vietnam after we lost 15,000 men? Well, because we already lost 15,000 men. We can't leave now. When you've compromised everything you are to defend a man, you have to convince yourself that you're doing right, because otherwise you have to look in the mirror and recognize that you've basically sold out everything you believe in. Now, that takes into account the people that were there from the beginning, but then keep in mind, every intervening election, now you're actually electing true believers, and now you have a party largely made up of people that have been true believers that were radicalized since Donald Trump.
But I think for many of us, it wouldn't be surprising that a charismatic figure would have this kind of sway and would build over time. But Donald Trump is so consistently, we've seen it already in this campaign. He appears at the Black Journalists Association and unnecessarily says things that damage his candidacy. He doesn't seem to have the ability to actually run a competent campaign, and yet nonetheless, within the core of people who truly believe in him, it doesn't damage that standing there. So how is it that he is the one able to accomplish this?
Well, eventually, when you're a leader of a cult and you've made enough examples of people that go outside of the cult, Liz Cheney and I, for example, we go outside of the cult, we get politically executed. Eventually, you only have to execute so many people that leave until everybody ends up staying in. And again, we do things as humans, and maybe, I'm sure there's a psychiatrist on this call that would understand. I don't know the term, but you eventually just come to convince yourself, because that's the only way that you can protect yourself from that. So look, I think it's a matter of, like, okay, we say he's not what was the word, not a great speaker, right? Not charismatic. Yeah. Well, if you think about it, and I don't think necessarily now, but leading up to it, he did have a lot of charisma that people like you and I don't fully understand. Because if you're in the middle of the country, or you're in, Appalachia, and you feel like you've been left behind, your government's been forgotten, and Donald Trump comes out and says things that are totally irreverent, that no politician ever said, and he's doing it supposedly on your behalf, I think to a lot of people that is charisma. And so I think that's a little bit of what we're dealing with. But now people are so invested in Donald Trump's the guy that they can't turn on him.
Well, and I wonder too, how much of this is legitimate, that people in the middle of the country have this sense that these highly educated elites are really tell them how to live, tell them how they can talk, what they can do, that they have to be vaccinated, that they've got to close their businesses, that all of this, and of course this came during Trump's first term, but it's sort of, that's not in isolation. The sense I think many people in the middle of the country have is that you've got Democratic elites, for a lack of a better term, want to tell them how to live and act morally superior to them. How much do you think that's true?
I think, well, in terms of, is it true that they're really doing that? I don't necessarily think so. The perception, though, is reality. And I think the perception is solid. So obviously I represented a rural district in Illinois. And let's just take this. So, each political movement, we have moments where they go kind of extreme and then come back. And so if you look at, for instance, the riots in 2020, right? Cities being burned down with these BLM protests, which, by the way, I got activated for. I was there with the military in Minneapolis. But the perception in the middle of the country is, okay, they're allowed to burn down buildings and, occupy police stations. Well, that makes me angry. That's a lawless feeling. And then this idea, by the way, let me go into this for a second. I think there is a real crisis of masculinity in this country. Okay. What I think masculinity is when strong people defend vulnerable people. I think masculinity would be like supporting Ukraine against Russia. Masculinity is trying to help people that are poor and give them a leg up. But what happened is there was a pretty far left movement that started to call anything male like toxic masculinity. And, we were supposed to be ashamed to be men. And that created a real anger within men, particularly men in the Midwest, and particularly white men. I don't think that's there anymore, but I think the perception is it is. And how let's call them the Andrew Tate kind of bro culture.
Barstool sports.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What they did, and Donald Trump is really good at this, is they convinced men that if you yell, if you're obnoxious, if you cuss, and you're mean to women, that is masculinity. And the problem is it's not. And the problem is, what I just said, my definition of masculinity is, we actually need a lot more people out there saying that, but this is a subject people are scared to touch. Nobody wants to defend masculinity, right?
Well, this is fascinating. I have a 23-year-old son. He's in law school right now, and he's been sharing with me for the past few years because he sees on social media and has contact with all these young men who are disaffected. And he was sort of bringing this to my attention before I was aware of it from other sources. And then we see the most recent polling of men under 40 that there's tremendous support from young men for Trump. Just exactly what you're speaking to, that they see him as someone they relate to more than they did Joe Biden, and presumably more than Kamala Harris.
And that's what's tragic is, when you talk about toxic masculinity, that actually is toxic masculinity. There was a Barbasol commercial where, there was this guy fighting in World War II, and he's supposed to be your grandpa. And he's like, hey there, sunshine, I noticed you, use hashtags and everything, shave like a man, Barbasol. And it was actually a really good ad. Well, that was people were outraged at that. They said that was toxic masculinity. That's not. That's guys being funny. But what we have now in reaction to that, and I'm not saying it's entirely the far left's fault, not at all, because everybody's responsible for who they are. But I think that created an opportunity for pretty bad actors to come in and say, no, no, masculinity is being a huge jerk. And this is why I think we need men in particular to start talking about, in my mind, what real masculinity is. Like I said, it's defending people, right? It's defending your family. It's actually kindness. That's very masculine. And that's what needs, because they've been abused, I think.
Adam, you were mentioning about being activated to go with military support to Minneapolis. Let's talk about Governor Tim Walz, because the vice president chose him as her running mate when she could have chosen someone more moderate. She went with a full-on progressive from a state that's not in play politically, that's safely Democratic. And so I wonder, for you as someone who is generally conservative, if you were disappointed in the choice that she made.
Honestly, I wasn't. And I'll tell you why. Mine's unique because I know Tim Walz. I served with him in the House, and I know him to be a genuinely good man. Interestingly, he was very moderate in the House. And, I don't think this is a bad thing to say he was moderate in the House. He was a very progressive governor. He obviously knows who and what he's representing and kind of morphs to that. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's bad if you have people in elected office that do anything they have to stay in elected office. But I don't think it's bad to comport yourself a little bit to represent kind of the interests of your district. And I think he actually will end up being fairly moderate obviously he's not the one making the decisions on policy, but I think he'll end up being fairly moderate. But most importantly, this guy, we talk about the Midwest, right? This guy feels Midwest. That doesn't mean he's going to go rally everybody in rural Illinois to his side. But when I hear him talk as a Midwesterner, I live in Texas now, but as a Midwesterner, I feel a kinship to him. He's somebody that talks like I do. He wears camouflage and goes hunting. I actually think it was a brilliant choice. And I think he's, vice president can't necessarily make a ticket. They can break one. J.D. Vance is an example of that. But I think he was actually a pretty good pick. And I really like Josh Shapiro. That was kind of who I was hoping for, but it is what it is.
So what do you make of the fact that you have both of the major parties' presidential or presumptive presidential nominees choosing people who seem to be quite aligned with them, as opposed to providing what might have been some additional coverage in swing states with Vance and with Walz? You get people who are very dovetailing with the presidential candidates.
Yeah, I think it goes to show, if you're running for president, obviously you can pick from a state that you think you can win. You can pick somebody like Reagan did with H.W. Bush that is like kind of from a different area of the party. But I think there's a realization that really all that kind of vice presidential politics doesn't actually make a hill of beans difference. And what you really want is somebody that can communicate well and somebody that can work with you well, that's faithful to you, that obviously is going to not compete with you. And I think that's what we see in both. Now, there's two different things here. So Tim Walz comes with 24 years of military service. And by the way, the attempts to attack his military service as a veteran make me irate. And I can debunk every one of the attacks on him. But, and I think the vast majority of Americans look at him that way. J.D. Vance was brought in because Donald Trump was in this assumption that he was on a glide path to the presidency. And he saw J.D. Vance as his heir apparent. Obviously, they didn't do their research very well, because all the words from the inside now is that Donald Trump is angry, and he's of course going to pin this on J.D. Vance if he loses, because he can't take the blame himself. By the way, less than 50%, but greater than 0% chance that in the next week or two, Donald Trump replaces J.D. Vance on the ticket,
Really?
which would be interesting. Yeah.
What percentage did you just give for that?
So I said
greater
less
than
than
0.
50, greater than 0. Let's put it about a quarter. He's got, I think, until kind of early September to be able to just swap him out. And he has an excuse, because he can say the Democrats switched him out, so we're going to do the same thing, right?
Yeah, well, who would be the likely successor if he did that?
Oh, that would be interesting. I think he would try. I actually would not be surprised. He has moments where he can be politically smart. If he would try to bring somebody like Nikki Haley on, and of course she would take it because she has no moral center. She would just do it.
You say she has no moral center. So it sounds like you were not surprised that she ended up ultimately endorsing the former president?
Not at all. I supported her in the primary because she speaks well, and I think had she been president, she would have governed well. But look, the whole time she was out there saying Donald Trump is unfit, all these things about him. I knew when she drops out, she'll eventually endorse him because she's a political animal and she cares about her role in the party. And look, here's the superpower of the cult, okay? And this is where Democrats need to get better at because Republicans are really good at it. I could literally go on CNN tomorrow and say, you know what, Wolf Blitzer, I've realized that Donald Trump is actually a great man. I'm sorry for everything I've ever said about him. And I would get a call from Donald Trump that night, and I would be a hero in MAGA. They're very forgiving. You just can't go outside of the lines, but they'll welcome you with open arms. She knew that. J.D. Vance 7 years ago called him America's Hitler, for God's sakes. And so that's what they're good at. And I'd love at some point, I don't know if now's the time to talk about Democrat coalitions, but anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, go ahead into that. Yeah, give us a sense of that. Yeah.
Here's what I would say to Democrats. They're much better at putting down their extremes than Republicans are. The Republican Party was taken over by extremes. The Democratic Party has basically beaten their extremes back. They're really good at that. Where they could be better is welcoming conservative Democrats. Now, here's the problem. You're always going to have a primary, right? In primary, you get the hardcore party faithful. But look at like what they're doing in Texas, where I live. Colin Allred, pretty moderate Democrat. They basically paved the way for him to be the candidate. And he has a fighting chance against Ted Cruz. You know, it's going to be tough, but he's got a fighting chance because as much as I like Beto O'Rourke as a person, he was too liberal for the state of Texas. Colin Allred's running on the border, for God's sakes, right? And you look in Utah, I'm sure some of your folks here in Utah, the Democrats proceeded to not put up a candidate and support Evan McMullin as an independent. That is good strategy. So if the Democratic coalition can welcome moderates, maybe not full conservatives, but moderates to the Democratic Party, I got to tell you, the Democrats will be undefeatable, especially if they can hold their extremes down.
And will that get conservative Republicans? Because I think one of the main themes that we want to address with you tonight is where do conservatives go? You've made your choice. It's to endorse the Democratic ticket. As you said, that's your opponent who's immediately, Trump's your opponent immediately in front of you. That's why you're doing it. That's not going to be enough for a lot of conservatives. Mm-hmm. So where do they go?
Well, I try to tell them a couple things. First off, I obviously encourage them to vote for Harris. If they tell me there's no way I can vote for Harris, I get it. And at that point, I remind them, look, if your country gives you two choices for president that you can't stand, there is no law that requires you to vote on the presidential line. You can write somebody in, you can skip that and vote down ballot. That's not being a bad American. That's just saying, look, these are two choices. I can't do it. So I think we need to give room to some conservatives to just abstain if they can't stomach Kamala Harris. But in the long term, I see this. If Trump loses, and he loses big, there's a chance, small chance, that in 5 years, 5 or 10 years, the Republican Party can go back to being the kind of party we remember. What that's going to take is somebody with a lot of charisma, frankly, to just bring the party back and remind them of their roots and give a vision for the future. By the way, really quickly, that's why Kamala is crushing Trump. It's not policies, it's because she gives a vision for the future and he just sits around with grievances. Now, if the party isn't saved and it ends up being this nationalistic fascist party, then I think there will either have to be a coalition in the Democrats to take conservatives, or at least accept them, or else there will be a third party. It's virtually impossible for a third party to work now, but there's a verse in the Bible that says, if nobody worships God, the rocks will cry out. And I think of that in terms of politics. If you feel unrepresented for long enough, eventually you're going to do something about it. And I think that's where a conservative party or a centrist party, it would kind of be cool to have a centrist party that could drag both parties back to the center. But I think we will be there if in fact it stays like it is.
as has been observed so frequently, the parties used to have overlap. There
They did.
used to be abortion rights restrictionists in the Democratic Party. There used to be plenty of pro-choice Republicans. On other issues, there was plenty of crossover. And now, of course, you just have almost none of that. So the idea of a third party that would sort of represent what used to be that overlap, it's sort of hard to understand. Well, how would they make their appeal if they couldn't be purists, so to speak?
That's right. That's a great question. And that would be the difficulty. By the way, quickly, I think we look back in the past, I actually think there were four parties. Two of the parties had the same names, right? There are two Democratic parties and two Republican parties. There was liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats. So you really had a four-party system where they made coalitions, and it worked beautifully. Like, I used to never understand like coalition governments and parliaments. Now I get it, and I'm like, yeah, actually kind of makes sense. So how do you do it is, and this is the tough part, because we have been programmed. If you've seen the movie The Matrix, we've been plugged into the Matrix and told to believe that you pick a party based on policies, and that every policy only has two sides. You're pro-life or you're pro-choice, pro-gun, anti-gun, right? Whatever. The truth is there's 100 positions on abortion. There's 100 positions on guns. And a centrist party would have to say, okay, our platform is not this issue, this issue, this issue. Our platform is, generally smaller government, strong defense. I think you need to have a thing on those. But everything else is, if you believe within the margins of sanity, you belong in this government or in this party. It's going to take a lot to reprogram people to that. But that's how the parties used to be.
How is it, separate issue, that, because you mentioned if Trump was wiped out in this race, that might cause a reckoning within the Republican Party, but how is it that Trump goes down to defeat 4 years ago, and losers, look at Mitt Romney, used to be, have to carry that burden. Oh, you're a loser, and would never be supported. And there were certainly plenty of other Republicans who you could argue would have been much stronger candidates in a general election than Donald Trump. Nikki Haley might well have been favored had she been the nominee, but she wouldn't have been alone. So how is it that Republicans don't seem to think of this strategically at all?
That's a great question. And here's the answer. I'm going to let you know a little secret. There's one person to blame for this. His name is Kevin McCarthy. That's it. Now, let me tell you why. So after January 6th, the 10 of us that ultimately voted to impeach Donald Trump, I actually tried to get us to, in essence, have a coup in the party to take it over. And, I had a plan. We had a plan to basically control the money downtown, the PAC money, and in essence, be a clearinghouse for who is pro-democracy, who isn't, who we should starve out of the party. And unfortunately, the rest of my impeachers got cold feet and decided it was time for unity in the party. So what happened is, for about 3 weeks after January 6th, it was crickets. Nobody knew where this was going. Donald Trump was done. He was persona non grata. Remember, nobody even showed up when he left Andrews on Inauguration Day. The second that Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago, it changed on a dime. And Kevin McCarthy made that decision because he's selfish. The only thing he ever wanted was to be speaker. And he made the decision, it was the true decision, that he could not take on MAGA in 2 years and then be able to organize enough to become speaker. So he took the easy way, which is to embrace MAGA, because he knew everybody else would fall in line. And that's exactly what happened. You pair that now with all these people watching Fox News, they look at the leaders they trust besides Donald Trump, and these leaders are telling them exactly what Trump is telling them, telling them the election was stolen. So they all end up eventually believing the election was stolen from Donald Trump, because everybody they trust is saying it was. So
Even
why
without any evidence whatsoever that there was fraud that led to the result of the election that it did. I mean, that's the other thing that I think is hard for many people to fathom is, it's one thing to make the claim, but it's another to have no evidence to back it up.
And that's the interesting point, is if Donald Trump would have made the claim with no evidence to back it up, I don't think people would have by and large bought into it, besides the most hardcore. But when all of a sudden Donald Trump says it's stolen, and then Kevin McCarthy is on Fox News saying, call your congressman because they're stealing this election. Then your local congressman is on local NBC saying this election was stolen. Even if you don't have great evidence, you're going to look there and be like, they know something I don't. And so that's why Donald Trump is still alive, is because they're convinced they took this election from him. And I mean, the height of all irony is anybody, frankly, even Ron DeSantis, but anybody but Donald Trump would have probably won this in November and probably would have been president for 8 years. Instead, they went with the psycho small guy who's a whiner, and he could only be president for 4 years anyway. It doesn't make sense, but that's what happened.
All right. Let's talk a bit about also what's happened with abortion rights, because the great irony, of course, is with the Supreme Court Dobbs decision, we've seen public opinion shift pretty sizably towards pro-abortion rights position. We've seen these measures in the states go down to defeat, even in heavily conservative states. So again, when the party looks at that strategically, if you're someone who is abortion restrictionist, how do you think this has worked for you?
Well, factually, it just hasn't worked. I mean, there are more abortions today than there were before Dobbs was overturned. You know, public opinion on the pro-life was actually trending towards the pro-life side. Younger people were much less likely to have an abortion because of the increase in the ability to see what a baby looks like, you know, before it's born. And now it looks more human than it used to. And so you saw this happening. But what happened is, you know, the people that are on the outside of an issue are always more excited. So the pro-lifers were more excited because obviously there were abortion rights in the country. The second that is stripped, pro-lifers kind of lose their energy a little bit. And now the pro-choicers have the energy. And this is going to work to their advantage in November. But this is the craziest thing is when you're in a race to cruelty, which is what happens in primaries now. It's not even a race to conservatism or a race to right. It's a race to cruelty. All of a sudden, you go from saying we should have restrictions after 15 weeks. Well, the guy running against you says 12. Okay, well, I can't be outflanked by him. I'm going to say 6 weeks. And then the guy says, well, no, I think we need to prosecute women who have abortions. And that ends up becoming the standard in the party. We should have, as pro-life Republicans, we should have said, okay, Dobbs is overturned. Now we're going to move heaven and earth to make sure that we're taking care of women with unwanted pregnancies. We're going to make adoption easier. We're going to help, you know, people to find resources they need. But they didn't. They raced to cruelty. And as a result, my guess is more and more states are going to codify abortion, probably in ways that nobody ever imagined.
To get to some of our viewer questions, we always have terrific participation from our viewers. A number of people have asked, Adam, why did you decide that you would not stand for re-election? And do you have thoughts of running for Congress or another office in the future?
So it's first of all, if I'd have run again, I certainly wouldn't have won in the Republican Party. Let's be clear. But that's not why I didn't run again. Truthfully, my last term, I had really considered not running for that already. Like, you know, Arthur Brooks, who probably many of you know, used to run AEI. He told me once, he said, you can do anything with passion for 10 years. And after 10 years, you either need to move out or you need to refine your passion. And that actually, I sensed that in Congress. I was passionate about it for 10 years. And until January 6th happened, you know, which gave me another purpose, I had felt that passion, that fire kind of being lit or being snuffed out. So that's why I didn't run again. It was both, I wouldn't have won. Frankly, I've won every election I've run, and I can still say that. But the other thing is, did I really have the passion, particularly to run again in a party that I'll maintain the Republican label, but I don't identify with them anymore. And I've been voting Democrat the last couple of years. In terms of running again, look, 2 years ago, I would have told you, heck no. You know, I was burned out, everything I'd been through, but now the fire's coming back a little bit. And, you know, I'm finding this passion again. I love just speaking truth. I love seeing people's reaction when you speak truth, because it's like stuff that's in their soul that nobody said. And it's like, yes, I agree. And so I would consider running again, never for the House, done with the House, but, you know, Senate, governor, or president someday, depending.
Peter in Santa Monica asks, will any of the, to this point, undisclosed January 6th committee evidence be released before the election so voters have a chance to consider it?
Yeah, so everything is out there. Everything that we had. In fact, if you Google like January 6th evidence, it'll I think the website is GovInfo. You can pull up the January 6th report, which is then attached to all of the evidence. The only evidence you can't find is stuff that was a national security threat, identity of some of the people that testified that worked in the Situation Room. Donald Trump made up this whole attack that we deleted everything, and people just believe it. We didn't delete a single thing. I mean, everything is out there. So unfortunately, we were limited. I think we made a very compelling case, but we were limited by time. And then we were limited by the fact that people would simply come in and plead the fifth or refuse to testify. And so I think more of that evidence will come forward as Jack Smith's case. I think he's probably got stuff we never even dreamed of. But of course, what happened with the Supreme Court, it's going to put this off a little bit. But I think that will all be exposed in due time.
Steve in Los Angeles asks, what's happened to Liz Cheney? She was vocal about Trump and he should never be president again, but she seems to be missing. She's not on cable news programs, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I still kind of go back and forth and chat with her sometimes. Liz Cheney, just being honest, she's a Cheney. She holds her cards very close to the vest. I think that's a result of probably being the vice president's daughter and thinking you can't trust anybody. But I don't know. I would not be surprised if kind of towards election day she comes out for Kamala Harris. But I frankly would have expected her to say more by now. So I really admire her. She made the January 6th committee successful. I wish she would be a little more vocal too.
Susan asks, do you think that if former President Bush spoke up about the election and denounced Trump, do you think it would have an effect on any Republican or independent voters?
I do. So, like when I speak out, people ask me, well, you've been basically excommunicated from the party. Why do you think it'll help? And I'm like, well, I don't think I'm going to win 80% of the party because of me saying it. But there is 20 to 25% of the Republican Party that's voting Republican kind of on autopilot. They hate Donald Trump, but they're like, I just can't fathom voting Democratic. And I think people like me speaking out, people like Liz, if she would, people like George W. coming out, is that piles on to giving people permission to then say, okay, I'll do it. I mean, we got to remind people like 40 out of 45 of Trump's cabinet officials don't support him. His own vice president doesn't support him, for God's sakes. And now if you get, Mitt, George W., and others, I think it's enough to peel off a certain part of that GOP that is salvageable, I think.
Ronald in Bend, Oregon, along with some other viewers, have asked in this extension of the last question, why other prominent Republicans won't endorse Vice President Harris. Why wouldn't Mitch McConnell or other people like that come out and do so?
It's just fear. It's like, Mitch, especially, it's crazy because the dude is done with politics, right? He's not going to run for anything else. Keep in mind, Mitch McConnell is the reason that Donald Trump's running again also, because had he chosen to convict Donald Trump, Trump would have been he would have been convicted in the Senate, and Trump would be ineligible to run. Instead, he said, "Oh, we'll let the law take care of it." And then all of a sudden, now the law can't take care of it. But anyway, somebody like a Mike Pence is a little more disappointing because what these people they try to do is, look, let me just say this: getting kicked out of your tribe, fully kicked out, is something people fear more than they fear death. Okay. Anybody will step in front of a train to save a kid, and that's heroic. But not everybody will leave their party because all of a sudden your phone blowing up with texts from people that can't believe you did what you did. You lose friends, your whole social circle. And if you still have this idea, like I'm sure Pence does, that he may run for president again someday, he won't. That's what he's doing. He's trying to maintain his cards. I think it's chicken, to be honest with you.
Were you describing yourself when you were talking about the texts and losing friends?
Yeah.
Give us a sense of how your life changed after you came out and denounced the former president.
Well, it started with, right after I voted to impeach, I got a certified letter from my extended family. So my dad's cousins, not my immediate family, disowning me. They said, the opening line was, "Oh my, what a disappointment you are to us and to God." Okay, right? And you've lost the trust of great men like Sean Hannity and stuff. I mean, but it was bizarre. It was brainworms. But friends, here's two quick stories. A year and a half ago, I get a text from the guy that was my co-pilot in Iraq. No tighter bonds than fighting in war together. And he said, "I'm ashamed to have ever flown with you." And then 3 weeks ago, I get a text from a guy that I worked for my first job out of college that I had been friends with before that, and that I had continued to be friends with, blaming me for the attempted assassination of Donald Trump because of what I'm saying about him, and said, "If you're going to keep talking about Donald Trump, don't ever bother talking to me again." And I said, "Hey, no worries. I'm blocking you now, so I'll do that for you." But that kind of stuff happens all the time. And it's a really taxing price to pay. I'm used to it now, but it doesn't make it easy.
Yeah, I can't imagine you ever get used to that. John and Robert, who have served in the military, George, another viewer, they all ask you to address the criticism of Governor Walz's military record, particularly in contrast to Donald Trump and John McCain's military service, and the criticism you mentioned earlier from Trump. Please elaborate on that.
Well, let's be clear. A lot of people dodged the draft in Vietnam. But if you dodge the draft in Vietnam, you don't have a right to attack anybody's military service. And that's what's despicable about Donald Trump. Not just attacking Walt's military service, but all the other stuff that we talked about. He has like a disdain for people that serve in the military. Honestly, it's weird. Calls, fallen soldiers suckers and losers. General Kelly said that he was irate because they had an amputee on the stage with him and he thought it was gross. This is what kind of a son of a B word this guy is. And so with Tim Walz, look, it's very easy. First off, Tim Walz could have retired at 20 years, but he stayed in the Guard, okay? And that was past 9/11. He was always within a window he could have deployed to war. Anytime you're past 20 years, you can retire whenever you want. That's the rules. You can retire whenever you want. And so let's say he even knew a deployment was coming and chose to retire. That's okay. I know a bunch of yeah, I know a bunch of people that retired right before another deployment because they're like, "I don't want to go on deployment again." That was their right. We didn't begrudge them. Secondly, I don't think he knew there was a deployment coming anyway. And thirdly, had the military needed him, so had he really left his men out to dry, had the military needed him, they could stop loss him, which is a procedure to say, "You can't retire now. We need you." That happened to thousands of people. They didn't do that. He was fine to retire. Yet you can't say he abandoned his men when the guy running for president on the other side of the ticket abandoned his entire country when his country needed him. And then lastly, with Walz, they attacked him for the rank situation. He was a command sergeant major, and then he got to look. That is completely normal. If you don't do 3 years in a specific rank, you revert to your previous rank upon retirement. That's a nothing burger. But what they do is, since 99% of the country doesn't serve and doesn't understand kind of the intricacies of the military, they take advantage of that and make it look like a scandal and then make you defend yourself. And that by definition makes you look guilty. Tell me anybody who ever served in the military that now wants to run for office. Why would you? Because if you ever once said anything that was an exaggeration, accidentally wrong, or whatever, now you're going to be attacked by people that didn't serve at all for the one thing you said that one time. If I was getting started in politics now, I would basically hide the fact that I was in the military for that reason.
Wow. Margaret asks, if the Harris-Walz ticket wins, what happens with Trump supporters and the anger that they have? Are you concerned about violence following that potential result?
I am concerned, and particularly if it's close. I don't. Now, here's where, and I'm going to write this at some point because I don't think people are talking about it enough. I don't think there'll be another January 6th at the Capitol. I think the concern is these state capitals. So what happens if you have election officials, many are MAGA now, that just refuse to certify results? Now you have to go to court, try to get a court order to get them to certify. And then what happens in a state, let's say like Arizona, let's say Kamala wins Arizona, but it has a Republican legislature, and they simply determine that they will not certify that Kamala won. In fact, they may make a decision to vote for the Trump slate of electors, even if it's against the wishes of their people. I don't know, but constitutionally, the Supreme Court may find in their favor to have the ability to do that. That is where I'm worried, is that at that state level, that there's going to be shenanigans, and that could lead to intimidation, to violence, and everything else.
Well, and if it was necessary for the military to intervene to keep the peace, is it equipped to do that domestically? I mean, is that a prospect that the military could be called in?
It is equipped to do it. Here's my concerns is first, your first line of defense would be the National Guard. The problem with the National Guard, you could federalize them, but they're under the purview until you federalize them of different states. So now you think about, will a red state governor send the National Guard? No. So now you have what? Blue state governors sending guard into red states. What if the red state decides that they don't want the blue state National Guards to come in and they use their guard, similar to the standoff back in the 60s? And then let's say you invoke the Insurrection Act, which allows you to send federal troops. I mean, you think about how chilling that will be. And then if you truly, and this isn't going to happen soon, but if you're in a Civil War type scenario, I could imagine somebody like Donald Trump going on television and saying, you military members are required to follow the Constitution. The president is breaking the Constitution, therefore follow me. And you could see a number of military members simply defect, like you saw in Syria in the Syrian Civil War.
Wow. Eric in Los Angeles says, as a pro-Israel Republican, are you concerned about Harris-Walz administration's policy toward Israel?
I don't think I'm too concerned. I think, look, it'll be probably similar to what you see Joe Biden doing. I haven't loved everything Joe Biden's done, but I think generally he's shown, I wish some of it was a little less in the public, but I think he's playing a bit of a calming influence on Netanyahu, which is necessary. I think it's important for the United States to come in with our perspective. He's continued to give Israel seemingly everything they need. We've been there to defend Israel when they've been attacked. I think it'll be probably fairly similar. I'm always concerned that the Gaza occupiers will have too much influence in the Democratic Party. I just don't necessarily see that as a massive concern quite yet.
Joel in Los Angeles asks, has the Trump fever broken with the burst of enthusiasm for Kamala Harris? And wondering if that could be sort of a first step toward rebuilding of the Republican Party.
I feel like the fever has broken by and large in the country, the Trump fever, but not necessarily within the hardcore MAGA, within the people that still control the GOP. So is that going to affect the GOP? I don't know, because again, those with a controlling interest in it, the MAGAs, the people that 8 years ago never would have had a place in the party. They were the weirdos sitting at the corner table. Now we're in charge. But I feel like it's broken in the country. And Kamala can keep this momentum going, even if it slows down a little bit. She's benefited from a major thing, which is America was just dreading a Biden-Trump rematch. So anytime you got new blood in there, it was enthusiasm. And that's what she's really benefiting from. And she's done a good job, frankly, with harnessing that. I mean, as a Christian, she has a evangelical Christians for Kamala meeting. Like, Democrat, right? Well, nobody ever thought that would happen, but there's these coalitions that are being built as people are seeing this big thing out there.
Do you think that Democrats should have confronted President Biden earlier and convinced him to withdraw earlier so they could have had a full-on primary to really battle test a variety of candidates?
Well, it may, given how really easy this transition was, it may end up working in their favor that didn't happen. But I think more principally, yes. I mean, obviously, absolutely. I think, look, there's stuff I vehemently disagree with Joe Biden on. The withdrawal from Afghanistan is one of those. There's things I really admire about him, standing with Ukraine, for instance, although I wish he'd have done a little more. But he lost his step, and it was very clear that he was not going to be able to compete against Donald Trump. And that's why Donald Trump's so angry now, because a month ago he thought he was on a free glide path to the presidency. So yeah, I think they should have. Seems like they kind of closed in the cocoon and protected a lot of information from getting out. The good news is eventually it did, and we are where we are now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you before we wrap, we're getting close to the end. You have an organization, Country First. What does it do?
Yeah, so Country First, it's country the number one ST, so country1st.com. Look, we're focused on a couple things. So in the short term, we're going to be playing against Donald Trump in key states, and it's with a unique message. So everybody in the, many people think Donald Trump is this tough guy, right? What we like to do is expose the fact that he's a victim, he's weak, he's a whiner, he's annoying, and we're going to focus that on a specific group of people that are gettable. So that's our near-term focus, as well as going after MAGA candidates. That's the political side. The unpolitical side, so the kind of nonprofit side, we're doing a lot to help Ukraine, to lobby Congress to continue to stay engaged in Ukraine. And then I have Country First Academy, which is, sadly, we have to do democracy building here at home now, like we've always done overseas. So it's an academy that helps to find candidates, Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. The only requirement is you swear to put country over party, and it teaches you how to run for office, whatever office that is. And it's building that next generation of people to be able to do that. And in long term, I'll just say this, after the election, we have hundreds of thousands of members. What I'm really passionate about is that both parties are still putting up the same solutions to old problems. I think we live in such a leap of technology and a leap of humanity that there are solutions out there that nobody's discovered, poverty, whatever it is. And I want to create an incubator for ideas, for people to come forward with never before thought about solutions to problems. I don't care if they're conservative or liberal or something brand new, because that's what we need, is that next generational leap to solve our problems. So that's what Country First is doing.
We have a number of viewers who have asked about the animating emotions of Trump supporters and wondering how much of it relates to racist views or misogynist views or even white nationalist or Christian nationalist views. What are your thoughts on that?
So my view is there's a very small group of people that may be motivated by white nationalism. There's a larger group of people motivated by Christian nationalism because they've been convinced that somehow what Donald Trump is espousing is Christianity. It's not. Obviously, it's not. And the interesting thing is, you ask a lot of these Christian nationalists who go out there and, he's fighting for God. They probably don't go to church at all. So to them, it's become like the Crusades was. It's more of an identity and less about an actual belief system. So I think that's a fairly large motivator. And I think you can talk about racism, maybe not directly as racism. And if you hook these people up to a lie detector, they may pass it that they're not racist, but it would be like second or third degree racism, which is like this concern that the inner city is bursting out, or this concern that the southern border, and we do have to control the southern border, by the way, but that I mean, I'm pretty convinced that if it was Irish coming over or Germans coming over, at as much as we are out of Central and South America and Mexico, they probably wouldn't be upset about it as much. So I think there's like second and third order racism in there that maybe they don't fully recognize.
And speaking of the southern border, because we haven't touched on immigration, do you have concerns about a possible Harris administration, how she would deal with the demand at the southern border?
I do. And that's why I'm pleased to see her being more hawkish on the border. It is not racism. I kind of worry that Democrats were so against border control, not because of the actual policy, but because Trump was for it. And what we can never have is being for or against something because you don't like somebody that takes the other side of it. I've worked the border with the military, and I'm going to tell you, it is a crisis down there. And it's not because all these Mexicans are coming over. It's because it's human trafficking. We will find bodies in the desert every day of people that were left behind. It really is, and it's funding the cartels even more than drugs are. So I do have a bit of a concern, but I think the fact that she has pivoted to more of a hawkish position on the border is certainly great. By the way, we could have made some big progress on it, but Donald Trump tanked the most hawkish border bill to ever come before Congress.
We have about 30 seconds. Quick closing thoughts from you, Congressman.
Look, thank you for having me, first off, and thank you all for continuing to stay engaged. And like I said, we need this unnatural coalition of, sane people on the right, the center, and the left to look at the differences and actually appreciate our differences, recognize that that's democracy, and stand together to fight back against this fascist authoritarianism. And then someday we can have the luxury to disagree on issues again.
Adam, thank you so much for being here this evening. It's
bet.
been a really interesting conversation. We appreciate it.
You bet. I enjoyed it. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much. Next week, we have two programs for you. Monday, it's Ambassador Dennis Ross, once again with Pat Morrison. It's the next Israel in Crisis program, number 17 in this important and popular series. Then next Wednesday, a week from tonight, August 21st, it's former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, with Warren Olney. Their topic, the world at war. Is there a chance for peace? Both programs next week, Monday and Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific as usual. And we ask you to please support these tremendous nonprofit programs and outreach of Jews United for Democracy and Justice. You can go to their website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org to make your contribution to help support these programs. Thank you for being with us. Have a terrific rest of your evening.